On the afternoon of June 18, 2002, 19-year-old Allie Kemp walked through the gate at the local pool where she worked in Leawood, Kansas, and headed towards a deck chair. Allie had on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, and she had a backpack slung over her shoulder. She also had a huge smile on her face because her boyfriend, Phil Howes, was sitting in the chair that she was approaching. Phil stood up, Allie threw her arms around his neck, and they kissed. Normally, they wouldn't do this at the place where they both worked, but it was a gray, cloudy day and nobody was swimming and there was no other employees on site. Allie had only been back home in the wealthy Kansas City suburb where she grew up for a few weeks after finishing her freshman year at Kansas State University. And almost as soon as her summer break had started, she reconnected with her high school boyfriend, Phil. They had actually mutually agreed to break up before they went off to different colleges, but now that they were back together, Allie felt like no time had passed at all. And it was nice that they even had the same summer job as pool attendants, so they got to see each other at work sometimes. Allie asked if anybody had come to the small neighborhood pool that day, and Phil told her it had been empty except for the landscaping crew, and he thought maybe the pool maintenance worker was coming by later. Phil grabbed his bag and told Allie he would pick her up that night for their dinner date they had planned. Then they kissed again, and Phil walked out to the parking lot. After Phil was gone, Allie tossed her backpack on the ground and sat down in the deck chair. She stared out across the empty pool and saw the landscaping crew trimming some trees on the other side of a low fence. They looked her way and smiled. Allie smiled back, but she kind of shrunk down in her chair at the same time. Being alone at the pool near a group of men she didn't know made her feel sort of uncomfortable. But the landscaping crew quickly seemed to forget about her and get back to their work, and Allie sort of forgot about them. Since there was literally nobody at the pool, Allie decided she would do something for herself. She opened up her backpack and pulled out a few brochures for different educational opportunities she had for her upcoming sophomore year. At college, Allie got really good grades, she was a student athlete, and was involved in multiple university clubs. In fact, she had been such an exemplary freshman at Kansas State that she had been invited by the U.S. State Department to join a group of 60 students from across the country who would study abroad and learn about diplomacy and American foreign policy. Allie knew it was a huge deal that she'd been asked to join this program, and she would have immediately jumped at the chance, but she also had another great offer. Her church group had asked her to join them on a study abroad trip to Russia, where she would work directly with young people in need, which was something she thought was extremely important. Both opportunities sounded incredible. Allie still couldn't make up her mind on which one she wanted to take, but either way, she knew she wanted to travel and experience other cultures. Allie had loved growing up in Leawood, and she enjoyed going to college not too far away, but she was ready to get out of Kansas for a while to see what the rest of the world had to offer. Around 3 p.m., an hour after Allie had gotten to the pool, there still wasn't anybody swimming. So she grabbed her backpack, stood up, and walked around the pool to a small table that was set up on the deck for employees. Once she was there, she pulled out her phone and called her boyfriend Phil. But he didn't answer. So she left a message and said she was looking forward to their date that night. Allie checked the time on her phone and sighed. Her younger brother, who also worked at this pool as an attendant, had told her he would come by a bit earlier to take over so she could go home and get ready for her date, but that was still almost 2 hours away. She grabbed a book out of her backpack and started to read, but she didn't feel right doing that on the job. So she decided to do a little work to pass the time. Allie got up, leaving her stuff on the table, and headed to the pump room, which housed pumps, filters, and other equipment to keep the pool clean. She was just about to start organizing the supply shelves when she heard a voice out by the pool. She thought maybe somebody had finally come to swim. Allie called to the person and said she'd be out in just a second. About 2 hours later, at 5 p.m., Allie's younger brother opened the gate to the pool, expecting to see his sister. But the pool was completely empty. He called out for Allie, but she didn't respond. He walked to the restrooms, knocked on the doors, and called for her again, but there still wasn't any reply. This was really weird. His big sister would never just duck out of her shift early. He waited for a little while, thinking maybe Allie had just run across the street for some food or something, but when another several minutes passed and Allie still didn't show up, he started to feel a bit worried. Allie's brother grabbed his phone and called his sister, but Allie didn't answer. And so he dialed another number, his father's number, and when his dad heard what was going on, he said he'd be right over. At 5:25 p.m., Allie's dad, Roger Kemp, arrived at the pool. He met Allie's brother just inside the gate, and he told his son to stay right there. Roger shouted for Allie over and over as he searched the area surrounding the pool, but Allie never called back. And when Roger saw Allie's phone, backpack, and book on the deck table, he was at a complete loss. It seemed like his daughter had just disappeared. He looked around for a little while longer, and as he did, he noticed the open door that led to the pump room. Roger walked through the door into that room, and right away he saw there were pool supplies scattered everywhere like they had fallen off the metal shelves they were kept on. And he saw a large blue tarp laying on the floor. And when Roger leaned down and lifted up the tarp to see what was underneath, his entire world shattered. His daughter, Allie, lay face down on the ground. Her t-shirt was tightly wrapped around her throat, and she was naked from the waist down. Her hands and arms were scratched and bloody, her face looked badly bruised and beaten, and her hair was matted with so much blood it stuck to the sides of her face. Roger grabbed his daughter and held her in his arms and told her to please stay with him. That evening, Sergeant Scott Hansen and Detective Joe Langer of the Leawood Police Department arrived at the neighborhood pool. They were still in shock from the call they'd gotten earlier from dispatch. A young woman had been brutally attacked at this pool, and she had been rushed to the hospital, but pronounced dead soon after. Violent crime in Leawood was rare, but a murder like this was just completely foreign to them. Hansen and Langer walked through the gate, and they quickly met a couple of uniformed police officers who led them around the pool to the crime scene. The door to the pump room was still open, and before they even walked in, the detectives saw pool supplies scattered everywhere, and a pool of blood on the floor near a blue tarp. The detectives put on their gloves and stepped into the room. Both men were known to be extremely calm and methodical, almost clinical when they conducted an investigation. But imagining what Allie must have gone through in this room made it impossible for them to hide their anger. They were part of this community, and they couldn't believe that something this horrific had happened to a young woman from their town. After the detectives had looked around the pump room for a few minutes on their own, several members of the county forensics team arrived and quickly began pulling blood samples from the floor. But as the group started investigating the pool supplies on the floor, one of the forensics officers told everyone to stop moving. He pointed to a small, white object on the ground, and he didn't want anyone to accidentally step on it or kick it. As the forensics officer inched across the ground towards this object, Langer and Hansen asked him, what was it? The forensics officer stared at it for a second, and then said it was a small cap to a bottle, and specifically, it had a brownish-red stain on it. The other officers continued to scan the floor. Partially hidden, amongst a bunch of pool supplies, one of them found a small tube of antibiotic ointment, and it had the same kind of stain on it as the cap. The forensics officers put the cap and the bottle side by side, and it was clear they went together. But both objects looked out of place among the other pool supplies on the floor. However, Detective Langer noticed an open first aid kit on a shelf, and he thought it might have come from there. But regardless, all the investigators felt sure that the brownish-red stains on the cap and on the tube were blood. So one of the forensics officers bagged the tube and the cap as evidence. While the forensics team continued their work in the pump room, the detectives walked back outside and made their way towards the pool. And they immediately saw that the arrival of the police had already drawn a lot of attention. 2 uniformed officers were doing everything they could to keep a large and growing group of bystanders on the other side of the gate. The detectives headed over to the crowd, and with the help of the uniformed officer, they took down names and statements from everyone who was there who claimed to have been near the pool that day. One person in this group was the man who actually managed the pool, and he gave the detectives the name of employees and others who occasionally worked on site. Members of that landscaping crew were also in the group, and a couple of them said that the only strange thing they had noticed that afternoon was that somebody had been laying on their car horn in the parking lot, just honking over and over again. Also, one of the landscapers added that Allie did not appear to be the first pool employee to arrive that day. Before her, a young man had been there, and when he and Allie saw each other, they had kissed like they were girlfriend and boyfriend. Later that evening, Detectives Langer and Hansen sat together in a cramped interview room in the police station. They had met with Allie's father, Roger, and also the rest of her immediate family, and after seeing how absolutely devastated they were firsthand, it had really motivated both detectives to do everything they could to solve this case quickly and bring some peace back to this family. A little while later, the door to the interview room opened, and an officer led in Allie's boyfriend, Phil, who politely introduced himself to the detectives and then took a seat across from them. As the victim's boyfriend, Phil basically automatically had become the first suspect on the detectives' list, and the nature of this crime made it seem even more likely that an intimate partner could have committed it. The attacker had clearly been enraged, and there was potential sexual assault. But only minutes into their interview, and Phil had given the detectives his alibi. He had a job at another pool in the community, and he had gone there right after leaving the pool where he worked with Allie. The detectives reached out to his employer at the other pool, and they confirmed that Phil had arrived on time for his shift and had not left early or anything like that. And so Hansen and Langer asked Phil if he would still submit DNA samples, and he agreed to do it without any hesitation. And then after getting those samples, the detectives let him go. The detectives could not fully rule out Phil's involvement, but his alibi was very strong, so they had to admit to themselves that maybe this was not an open and shut case. Not long after the meeting with Phil, a young woman came into the police station requesting to speak to whoever was in charge of Allie's case. Hansen and Langer met this young woman, and she told them she was one of Allie's closest friends, and she had been at the pool that day, and she was sure she had seen Allie's killer. The detectives quickly led Allie's friend to an office and sat down with her, and Hansen said he was surprised to hear that she was at the pool, because everyone they'd spoken to so far had said nobody had been swimming that day. Allie's friend said she had not gone swimming either. She said she had pulled into the parking lot of the pool and begun honking her horn over and over again. She told them she was just doing it as a dumb joke, trying to annoy Allie while she worked alone at the pool. But after honking, she never saw Allie. Instead, she said she saw this guy walking out from somewhere on the far side of the pool. She thought it was Allie's boss, so she stopped honking the horn because she didn't want to get Allie in trouble. But this guy ended up walking to the parking lot and just driving off in an old pickup truck. Detectives Hansen and Langer couldn't believe this. Was there actually a chance this young woman just happened to be at the pool playing a joke on Allie at the exact time of the murder, and that she had also seen Allie's killer up close? It seemed too good to be true. Hansen asked her if she knew who the man was, but she said she didn't. However, she said the guy had kind of creeped her out, because before he got into his pickup and drove off, he had looked right at her with a strange look on his face and smiled at her. As midnight approached on June 18, 2002, about 6 hours after Allie's body had been discovered, her dad Roger walked into the University of Kansas City Medical Center and approached the morgue. He knew this was where his daughter's body had been taken for an autopsy the next day. Roger found an employee and told her he'd be staying there that night. The employee was confused and said they weren't really set up for visitors. Roger said he understood, but he couldn't bear the idea that his daughter was all alone. The employee nodded and said he could stay if he wanted to. Roger thanked her, took a seat on a bench, and began his overnight vigil. In the days following the murder, detectives Hansen and Langer learned from the autopsy report that while Allie did have bruises that seemed to indicate an attempted sexual assault, no sexual assault had actually taken place. They also learned that she had put up a major fight, and so the medical examiner and the forensics team hoped they would find samples of the killer's DNA under her fingernails. And so while Hansen and Langer waited for these test results, they met with Allie's friends and family to try to get a clearer picture of her life. And they quickly realized Allie was not a young woman who lived dangerously at all. Allie was a standout student, she did volunteer work, she had a job at school and also over the summer, and she didn't seem to do drugs or drink alcohol. For the most part, her close friends and her boyfriend Phil led similar lives. So the detectives did not think Allie was mixed up in anything or with anyone that would have made her a target for a violent crime. And when they got the result of Phil's DNA test, there was no match to the crime scene. In fact, none of the DNA samples collected so far matched anyone in the FBI's national database. And so now, Hansen and Langer had to face the fact that they might be dealing with one of the hardest types of homicide cases to solve: a murder committed by an unidentified stranger. These types of cases can be so difficult that police often use the old cliche about trying to find a needle in a haystack when talking about them, because the suspect pool is basically infinite. At this point, Langer and Hansen's strongest lead was the man that Allie's friend had seen leaving the pool and getting into his pickup truck on the afternoon Allie was killed. But the detectives had no idea who this guy was. So they had Allie's friend sit down with a police sketch artist to describe the man as best as she could, and the police started distributing copies of the artist's drawing all over town. At first, this seemed like the right strategy to tackle a possible murder by a stranger because people started contacting the Leawood Police Department with tips almost right away. But this quickly proved to be overwhelming because the man in the drawing kind of looked like a lot of people. He was white, in his late 20s or early 30s, a little overweight, and starting to lose his hair. And so detectives Hansen and Langer soon found themselves fielding calls from all over the county. But most of these leads fizzled out almost immediately. At one point, weeks after the murder, the tips got so out of control in Leawood that people were approaching Hansen, Langer, and other members of the police force out in public just to claim that they were sure their brother-in-law or their cousin or some guy they saw was the person from the drawing. The investigative team got help from the county sheriff's department and other law enforcement agencies to try to pursue any viable lead, but none of these tips really seemed to go anywhere. And all of a sudden, months had gone by, and Langer and Hansen felt like despite chasing countless leads, they had basically made no headway in the case. And when 2002 came to an end, 6 months after Allie's murder, the detectives worried that the case was going cold and that they would soon be pulled off of it. On a morning in early February of 2003, so 8 months after Allie's murder, detectives Langer and Hansen were working together in Hansen's office when they got a message that Roger Kemp, Allie's father, was there to see them. Langer and Hansen had made a point to meet with Roger throughout the investigation, but they knew he had grown frustrated that no new evidence seemed to be coming in. Hansen went out to meet Roger, handed him a cup of coffee, and then led him back to the office. The detectives began by apologizing to Roger that they didn't have anything new to tell him, but Roger said he knew they were both doing everything they could. Still, though, he refused to just sit around and do nothing, and he understood as well as the detectives that if things didn't change soon, Allie's murder investigation would become a cold case. And so Roger said he had an idea that he wanted to run by the detectives, something he thought would help get the public thinking about Allie's case again. He wanted to put the sketch of the man Allie's friend had seen on some huge billboards in town and maybe out on the highway. He said he also wanted to offer a $50,000 reward for anyone who provided a tip that led police to Allie's killer. Roger said he would pay half, and he believed he could get the city to provide the other half. Hansen and Langer discussed it for a second. At the time, using billboards in a murder investigation was a radical idea. Police generally used billboards to help in missing person cases, but Langer and Hansen had never heard of using billboards to showcase a potential murder suspect. Still, they knew they did need to jumpstart the investigation, and this would definitely get people thinking about Allie again. And really, they were not about to tell Roger he couldn't do something that might help bring him and his family some kind of closure. A few days after this meeting, the first billboard featuring the drawing of the potential suspect went up in Leawood, and it would soon be followed by 3 more billboards. And almost right away, tips started coming into the police station again. And just like the last time this happened, it got overwhelming. But Langer and Hansen felt energized that the investigation had sort of gotten back on its feet. And so the detectives and their team methodically followed up on any leads that came in. Then, on June 18th, 2003, which happened to be the 1-year anniversary of Allie's death, they got a tip that felt huge. Someone who had seen one of the billboards called the tip line to say the guy in the drawing looked exactly like someone he knew, a man named Ted Hoover. And when Langer and Hansen heard this name, it immediately rang a bell. And so they dug through Allie's case file, and they came back to the notes they had taken from the very first day of the murder investigation. And that's when they saw Ted's name. He was the owner of a local pool maintenance company. Detectives Langer and Hansen didn't waste any time. They got Ted's address, headed out to their car, and drove across town. And when they arrived at Ted's house, they saw an old pickup truck parked in the driveway. It didn't exactly fit Allie's friend's description of the truck she had seen in the pool parking lot, but the detectives knew witnesses didn't always get all the details right, especially if they were uncomfortable or creeped out like Allie's friend had said she'd been. Langer and Hansen felt like, for the first time in this investigation, they might finally have the killer in their sights. Both men stayed completely calm as they approached the front door. They needed Ted to talk, so they didn't want to frighten him in any way. Hansen knocked on the door, and a few seconds later, a man answered. And this man looked remarkably similar to the sketch the detectives have been staring at every day for the past year. But the detectives didn't give off any signal that they thought that. Instead, they introduced themselves and asked the man if his name was Ted Hoover. He said it was, and so the detectives asked him if they could come inside and ask him a few questions about the young woman who had been killed at the public pool a year earlier. Ted, who seemed as calm as the detectives, said sure, and he led them inside. The three men sat down in the front room of the house, and Detective Langer started things off by telling Ted that somebody had called the tip line and pointed to him. And so Langer wanted to know if Ted had been anywhere near the pool where Allie worked on the day that she was killed. Ted remained totally calm. He said he was not surprised he'd come up on the tip line. He'd seen the billboards, and he knew he kind of looked like the man in the drawing. He also said he had not done any work on the pool where Allie worked, but he did have a lot of clients around the area, so there was a chance he could have been maybe nearby that day, but he wasn't sure, and he wasn't great about keeping records of exactly what he did every single day. The detectives looked at each other. This all seemed way too convenient. So Langer asked if Ted had ever met Allie Kemp, either at the pool where she worked or somewhere else in town. And Ted shook his head. He said he didn't know her, and he definitely did not have anything to do with her death. The detective spoke to Ted for a bit longer, and he was very cooperative throughout the entire interview. However, he couldn't provide them with any kind of solid alibi. And so at some point, Langer asked Ted if he would submit a DNA sample, just so they could cross him off the list. And at that point, the calm look on Ted's face completely disappeared, and he started acting very nervous. Ted must have noticed right away the vibe he was giving off, because he quickly told the detectives that his nervousness had nothing to do with the case. He just didn't like the idea of his DNA being part of some kind of national database. That just didn't sit right with him. The detectives tried to assure Ted that his sample would only be used to help with this particular case, but Ted said he didn't want anything to do with it, and he would need to speak with a lawyer. By the time Langer and Hansen left Ted's house, they were confident they had just found Allie's killer. His appearance alone had already been pretty solid evidence. I mean, he looked exactly like the sketch. But also, the detectives just didn't buy his paranoia around the national database thing. They figured the real reason he was afraid to give a DNA sample was because he knew the results would incriminate him. Since Ted did not voluntarily give up a DNA sample, the detectives would have to find enough evidence pointing to him that would enable them to secure a warrant so they could demand Ted to provide a DNA sample. And they knew if Ted really was lawyering up, their case would need to be airtight just to get that warrant. So, over the next several weeks, the detectives tried to find any proof they could that Ted had been at the pool on the day Allie got murdered. They got back in touch with the landscaping crew, Allie's boyfriend, and anyone else they thought might have seen him, but they didn't have any luck. Langer and Hansen refused to give up on this lead, though. It was the first time in over a year that they believed they were close to solving the case. So they dug deeper into Ted Hoover's background, hoping to find anything that might give them a clue. And they ended up finding something that completely blew their minds. Because according to multiple government documents, Ted Hoover had been dead for over a decade. With this bizarre new discovery, Langer and Hansen went to meet with Ted again. But this time, his house was empty, and none of his neighbors or clients had seen or heard from him. It was like he had vanished without the police even noticing. Hansen and Langer set out to find anyone who might know where Ted was, but nobody knew where he was, and nobody seemed to have spoken to him since he left. And the detectives knew that trying to locate a man who'd supposedly been dead for years and had seemingly just disappeared into thin air seemed like an impossible task. But the detectives caught a huge break when a couple of people who knew Ted said that before he disappeared, he had been dating a woman named Lara Barr. So Hansen and Langer shifted their focus to her, but tracking Lara down proved to be as difficult as tracking down Ted. She was nowhere to be found in Leawood, or anywhere in Kansas for that matter. Weeks, months, and then an entire year went by, and the detectives were still trying to find this woman who could maybe lead them to the man they were actually looking for. And in the meantime, they had to tell Allie's dad, Roger, that even though they believed they knew who had killed his daughter, they couldn't track him down. Finally, in the fall of 2004, which was almost 2.5 years after Allie's murder, Detective Langer got a hit on Lara Barr. He learned that Ted's one-time girlfriend, Lara, was now living in Connecticut with a man named Benjamin Appleby, an ex-convict who had been busted for armed robbery and indecent exposure. And when the detectives began digging into Benjamin Appleby's background as just part of their general investigation into Lara Barr, they realized Benjamin Appleby had a clear connection to Leawood, Kansas, and to Allie's murder case. In November of 2004, about 2 weeks after Langer and Hansen first located Lara, the detectives sat inside of an interview room with local detectives at a small police station in Connecticut. An officer led Lara in, and Langer asked her about her relationship with their suspect, Ted Hoover, and any connection Ted might have to Allie. Lara appeared to be as helpful as she possibly could be, but it became pretty clear within a few minutes of talking to her that she didn't seem to have any helpful information or really any connection to the murder. However, when her new partner, Benjamin Appleby, stepped into the interview room later that day, everything changed. Just looking at Benjamin made the hair on the back of Langer's neck stand up. And as the detectives spoke to Benjamin, slowly but surely, they realized he must know more about what happened to Allie than he was letting on. And so the detectives went on the attack, asking blunt and aggressive questions. And this tactic paid off, because the more they pushed, the more Benjamin began to crack. And soon, Benjamin broke down crying and said he knew who killed Allie. Based on Benjamin's interview, DNA testing, and evidence collected over the course of the investigation, this is what police believe happened to Allie Kemp on the afternoon of June 18, 2002. The killer walked through the gate and began to scan the area. They saw the pool was completely empty, and that the landscaping crew that had been working nearby had moved far enough away that the killer could remain out of their sight. The killer walked around the pool towards the pump room and then said out loud, "Is anybody here?" Even though the killer had clearly watched Allie from the parking lot and seen her walk that way, so they knew she was over here. And a moment later, Allie called out from the pump room that she'd be out in a second, and when the killer heard that, they felt a rush. And before Allie could even step out of the pump room, the killer stood in front of the door and blocked it, and then made a lewd remark about Allie's appearance and also made a clear sexual advance towards her. But Allie brushed the killer off and told them to get out of the way and tried to walk past them. The killer grabbed Allie and touched her breast, at which point Allie threw a punch. The killer blocked Allie's fist and immediately lost it and flew into a rage. They grabbed Allie by the shoulders and shoved her further back into the pump room, but Allie fought back, swinging her fists and scratching at the killer's hands and face. But the killer slammed her into the metal shelves and pool equipment fell onto the floor. Allie kept fighting, but the killer punched her in the head and face several times, stunning her and causing her to begin bleeding badly. The killer threw Allie to the floor and tore off her shorts and underwear, but Allie kept fighting back, so the killer punched her again and again until Allie finally stopped moving. At this point, the killer got up, opened a first aid kit that was on one of the shelves, grabbed a bottle of antibiotic ointment to use as a lubricant, and got back on the floor. Allie was still breathing, but she could no longer fight back. The killer began to undress themselves. Then they took off the cap of the bottle and climbed back on top of Allie. And just then, the sound of a car horn began to blare over and over again from the parking lot, and the killer panicked. By this point, they had already decided they were going to rape and then kill Allie, but now they were worried they were running out of time. Somebody was here. They were going to get caught. so the killer reached for the bottom of Allie's t-shirt. And at that point, Allie began moving again, and she tried to fight off the killer one more time. But the killer turned Allie over, pulled her t-shirt up to her neck, and wrapped it around her throat, and strangled her to death. Afterwards, the killer stood up and stared down at Allie's body. They looked around the room and saw a large blue tarp tucked in a corner. The killer grabbed the tarp, covered Allie's body with it, tried to pull themselves together as much as possible, and then walked out. The killer then made their way to their pickup truck in the pool parking lot, and before they got in, they made eye contact and smiled at a young woman who was sitting in her car. They didn't realize she was Allie's friend and was the one who had honked the horn. The killer then drove home, convinced they had not been seen by anyone who could pin Allie's murder on them. And for almost 3 years, the killer would believe they had been right. Until one day, a couple of detectives from Kansas came to Connecticut to question them. It would turn out Benjamin Appleby, the man who was Laura's new partner living in Connecticut with her, murdered Allie. However, that was not remotely the whole story, because it turned out Benjamin Appleby was also Ted Hoover, the pool maintenance worker and the investigator's prime suspect. Benjamin had done prison time for multiple charges in Missouri, where he was from, so he decided to leave his name and his past behind. He moved around to a few different places, and eventually he assumed the identity of a boyhood friend of his who had died at the age of 13, Ted Hoover. And with this dead person's name, he moved to Leawood, Kansas, and started his pool maintenance business. That's how he had first seen Allie and decided that he wanted her. But when Allie rejected his blatantly sexual advance one afternoon at the pool, he decided to rape and kill her. But Allie's friend honking her car horn in the parking lot altered those plans and made him go right to the murder. After Benjamin killed Allie, he went about his life like nothing had happened. And even when Allie's dad got the billboards put up with Benjamin's image clearly on them, he didn't panic. But when detectives Langer and Hansen showed up at his house asking for DNA samples, he realized they were closing in on him. So he decided to flee to Connecticut with his girlfriend Laura and start using his birth name again. But eventually, when the detectives tracked Laura down and learned she was living with this ex-con, a guy named Benjamin Appleby, well, they decided to look into Benjamin Appleby, and sure enough, it turned out he was Ted Hoover. When they finally interviewed Ben Appleby, aka Ted Hoover, in Connecticut, it seemed to the detectives almost like he was an entirely different person. The relatively calm, cooperative man they had spoken to in Kansas had transformed into someone who seemed completely devoid of feeling or empathy, someone they believed was evil from the second he walked in the door. In that interview, Benjamin ultimately confessed to everything. However, the detectives didn't want to leave any room for a court case to fall apart, so they finally got a DNA sample. And when the test results came back, Benjamin's DNA matched the sample they had taken from the blood on the bottle and bottle cap at the crime scene. Benjamin Appleby, aka Ted Hoover, was sentenced to life in prison with a chance for parole in 50 years. Roger Kemp's idea for running billboards with the potential murderer's sketch on them was a first-of-its-kind strategy in law enforcement. But now, as a result of its effectiveness in Allie's case, this strategy has been adopted by police departments all across the United States. On Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, 30-year-old Michael Wright hopped into a crowded elevator and pressed the number 81. Michael was an account executive for a telecommunications company that operated out of New York's famous World Trade Center. The World Trade Center was located in the financial district of Lower Manhattan. It was made up of 7 different buildings. Michael's building was one of the 2 identical, massive 110-story tall skyscrapers that were collectively called the Twin Towers, and then separately they were called the North Tower and the South Tower. Michael's company was in the North Tower. Once the elevator reached floor 81, the doors opened up and Michael squeezed his way out of the car, and right ahead of him, on the wall right in front of him, he would have seen 3 other elevator doors, and then on the wall behind him, there would have been another 3 elevator doors, one of which he just exited. To his right, there was just a wall, and then to his left was a set of glass doors that fed out into this big hallway that wrapped all the way around the building. Now, this hallway, there were offices on either side as you went around the 81st floor,
But while you were in this hallway, you couldn't actually look out the windows and see this incredible view of New York. The views were only accessible once you were inside of these various office buildings. And so Michael, he gets out of the elevator, he turns left, he goes through those doors, and then he turns right, and he starts walking down this hallway, and then he stops in front of this wooden door on his left. And this was the door to his company, which was called Networks Plus. So he opens that up, and right in front of him is this huge open office space with all these cubicles. And even though it was quite early, dozens of his coworkers were already there with their headsets on, and they're chatting and clicking away on their computers. But Michael was not in a rush. He had a morning routine, and he was not about to break it now. And so he just strolled into the room, he said hi to a couple people, and he walked as if he was going towards the very back of the office, towards the windows. But just before he reached the windows, he found his cubicle on the right, and so he dropped his bag next to his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he just kept on walking. He turned right, and he went down this corridor, and then he turned right, and he was facing this cafeteria. And the cafeteria for the company, it was really just this small room with a couple of tables and chairs. There was a fridge, there was a coffee machine. It was really just kind of a lounge area. So he went in there and he grabbed a paper cup, he filled it with coffee, and then he grabbed a bran muffin that was on a community tray. And then he left the cafeteria and went back to his desk, and he sat down. And when he sat down, it was 7:45 a.m. And so he didn't immediately turn on his computer and throw his headset on and just dive into work. Instead, he just kind of enjoyed his coffee, enjoyed his bran muffin, and thought about what he was going to do that day. Typically on Tuesdays, Michael would go out and see clients, and he would make some sales calls. And so Michael was just kind of sitting there getting his head right for the day. And then after he finished his breakfast, he threw on his headset, he powered up his computer, he checked his email, he started calling around to different clients to set up meetings for later that day. And then around 8:40 a.m., Michael realized he had to go to the bathroom. And so Michael took off his headset, he stood up, he turned around, he left his cubicle, and then instead of walking deeper into the office towards the windows in the cafeteria, he turned left and started walking back towards the main door that fed into his office. So he gets to this door, he opens it up, he steps out into the main hallway, and then he turns left and starts walking away from where the elevators are. Those are down to his right. And so he walks maybe 10 or 15 feet down this main hallway before he reaches a door to the men's room, which is on his right. And so he notices on the door, there's this sign that he hadn't seen before that said, "Please keep the bathroom clean." So he reads the sign, doesn't think much of it, pushes the door open, and when he gets in there, there's a couple of his male colleagues that are kind of yucking it up in the corner. And they're actually laughing about the sign that was on the bathroom door. Bank of America had just recently moved into the 81st floor. So now Michael and his company were sharing this floor with Bank of America, and Bank of America had put that sign on the bathroom door. And so the guys were saying, "Oh, so you come into our space and the first day you're here, you're telling us we're dirty?" And so Michael, he kind of laughed along with them because once you put it in context, it did seem kind of passive aggressive. At 8:46 a.m., Michael turned away from this group of laughing guys and began walking over to the urinals on the wall. But before he even got to the urinals, suddenly the building jolted hard to one side. Now, the Twin Towers were built to withstand very heavy winds, and so the way they were constructed to do that was they would flex several inches in any direction at any time. But this was not several inches, this was several feet. And it was so violent and so sudden that the marble on the walls actually cracked and fell off. And the guys in the bathroom, most of them lost their balance and fell to the ground. And the one guy who was inside of a stall, he comes running out, he bursts the door open, he's buttoning his pants up, and he's screaming, "What was that?" Michael, after standing back up, began thinking to himself, did I hear a sound? Was there an explosion? What was that? It must have been a gas main explosion. What else could that have possibly been? There was just nothing else he could think of that would account for that big of a shift. But there was just no time to sit there and dwell on how this happened because the alarms in the building started going off. And so Michael and the other guys that were in there, they just left the bathroom to go out to the hallway to see what was going on. And when Michael got out there, he looked left down the main hallway past his office, all the way down to the elevators. And all the way down there, he could see there was clearly fire spitting out of the elevator lobby area. And so before Michael could even process that there was this fire and what he was going to do about it, he heard screaming, a woman screaming behind him. The women's bathroom was right next to the men's bathroom. And so Michael and a couple of the other guys who had been in the bathroom with him, they go running into the women's room, and there was this stall, this bathroom stall in the women's room that had been kind of bent over. And it would turn out during the shift in the building, the door jamb on one of the stalls had folded over, kind of locking it in place. and there was a woman on the other side of the stall. There was a woman in the stall. And so that was the woman who was screaming. And so the men, they get in there, they start kicking and punching this door, trying to get it open. And finally they do, and they're able to pull this woman out. They go back out into the hallway, and right away, Michael notices there is a cloud of white smoke that is filling the entire hallway. It's towards the top, so they can kind of duck down to avoid the smoke. And so Michael's hunched down, and he looks left down the hallway towards where he knows this fire is, and he sees the fire has gotten much larger, and the flames have jumped into the hallway. It's still pretty far away, but clearly this fire is spreading. And so Michael, he's crouched down and he's watching as people are streaming out of his office down the hall, and everyone's kind of avoiding this fire. They're running up to where Michael and the others have congregated. Michael, who's crouched down, he's still kind of just looking generally towards the fire, almost stunned, when he notices something about the ground. There was this huge crack in the ground that ran from where he was all the way down the hall, all the way to the fire. And then Michael turned around and saw that crack actually continued all the way in the other direction. It looked like the floor had literally broken in half, and it was like the floor was going to fall off the building. And so as Michael is crouched down, just staring at this crack, not really sure what to think about it, he started to listen to what people were saying in the hall. Everyone's beginning to speculate about what caused this fire, what caused the building to shift like that. And a lot of people tended to believe it was a gas main explosion, which is what Michael thought. Other people suggested, maybe it was an earthquake, and some outliers said it could have been a bomb. But little did anybody know what had happened to their building was far worse than anything they could have imagined. A few minutes earlier at 8:46 a.m., as Michael stood in the bathroom kind of yucking it up with the other guys that were in there, American Airlines Flight 11, which was this massive 767 passenger airplane carrying 91 passengers, 5 of which were the hijackers, they slammed into Michael's tower 12 floors above Michael's head. The plane was traveling at about 466 miles per hour when it struck the building. The impact and subsequent explosion immediately killed not only everyone on board the plane, but hundreds of people that were inside of the impact zone, which was between floors 93 and 99. The plane also went right through the building, severing all of the stairwells and the elevator shafts, meaning anyone who was still alive from floors 93 all the way to the top, floor 110, all those people, they didn't have an escape route anymore. So they were trapped, they just didn't know it yet. And to make an already horrible situation even worse, after this plane detonates inside of the North Tower, it sends 9,000 gallons of burning jet fuel down these destroyed elevator shafts. And as this fuel tumbled, it would splash onto many of the floors below, like floor 81. The fuel would kind of splash through the openings to the elevator doors. And once a little bit had landed on that floor, the whole floor would catch on fire. But Michael and the rest of the people on floor 81 were completely oblivious to this. All they knew was there's a fire over there, and so we need to get away from it. But as Michael stood up from this crack and began kind of looking around to see what they were going to do next, he noticed that most of the people, while they were staying calm, were not really running to evacuate. They were just kind of standing around, and the different business managers from different departments were just kind of telling their staff members to stay calm and hold on, let's get our thoughts together. And Michael, who was not panicked, at least not yet, he's looking around thinking, you know what, let's just get off this floor. We need to get off this floor. And so he remembered that a lot of his friends, they would sneak out of the office and they would smoke cigarettes in this one particular emergency stairwell that was close to them. And so Michael just started yelling to the group, hey, we got to go now, we need to leave. There's stairs over there, follow me. And so Michael kind of cut through the crowd, and the crowd was very quick to respond. They kind of followed him, and he opened the door, he goes into the stairwell, and he lets some people go in. And before long, there's a very orderly double file line making their way down this stairwell. Michael remembers after he joined this double file line and began going down the steps, this immediate sense of relief, especially after they got down a couple of flights away from the 81st floor. Because in his mind, and in a lot of other people's minds that were in the stairwell with him, the problem was up there. It was the 81st floor. There was this one fire. It was localized. It would be dealt with. And they're already all the way down here. They'll be out of the building soon, so they got nothing to worry about. And so Michael and the rest of his coworkers just kept making their way down the stairs. It was very slow progress. And sometimes it would come to a complete standstill because other people on lower floors were entering the stairwell and joining in this evacuation. But Michael remembers nobody was freaking out. No one was panicking. There were some people that, were more worked up about it, but there really was this sense of safety, that they were in these stairs and that everything was going fine. And so as they're kind of making their way down, most people were concerned with trying to place a call to their family to just tell them, hey, I'm okay. This crazy thing happened at work today, but, I'm going to be fine. Michael had left his cell phone on his desk, so he didn't have a way to call his family. He got a coworker to give him his phone, and Michael tried dozens of times to reach his wife, Jenny, but when he called her, she didn't pick up, and so eventually he just gave the phone back to his coworker and just continued down the steps. At about 9 a.m., so that would have been about 10 or 12 minutes into this evacuation down the stairs, Michael, who again is in relatively good spirits, he knows there's danger upstairs, but they're safe down here, he makes this kind of off-color joke to lighten the mood in the stairwell. Michael turns to one of his male colleagues and pretends to confess his love to him and tells him, the only reason I'm confessing it to you now is because we're gonna die here anyways. Now, the joke here in Michael's mind was, of course we're not gonna die here. He was intentionally dramatizing the entire situation because they were safe. They were in the stairwell, they were evacuating, the fire was up there, they're down here, everything is fine. And some people thought the joke was kind of funny and they laughed at it. But the guy right ahead of Michael didn't think it was funny, and he turned around and looked at Michael and said, hey man, you gotta keep your humor down in here. So Michael, he did immediately regret telling his joke, but not because he was suddenly scared that this situation was far more dangerous than he was realizing, but because he just felt bad for offending some people. Michael would later reflect on this moment, and he would say he was so naive that even though he had seen the fire and seen the physical damage, that crack on the ground and the marble falling off the wall, that despite all that, it was like he just couldn't fathom that they were actually in any real danger inside of this stairwell. He really thought they were going to be just fine. But of course, as history would show us, Michael was wrong. Around the time that Michael was scolded for his off-color joke, about 200 feet to the south of the tower they were in, another passenger airplane, United Airlines Flight 175, crashed into the south side of the South Tower. All 65 passengers on board, which included the 5 hijackers, were killed instantly. The plane was traveling at about 590 miles an hour when it struck the South Tower, and it hit between floors 77 and 85, killing hundreds of people in the impact site and trapping hundreds more above it. And then just like the North Tower, after this plane detonated inside of the South Tower, it sent thousands of gallons of burning jet fuel down these destroyed elevator shafts, igniting fires on many floors below. Despite being so physically close to this second plane crash, Michael didn't hear it, and apparently no one else in the stairwell did either, or they just didn't recognize it for what it was. And so Michael and the others just continued walking down the stairwell thinking everything was fine. Around 9:30 a.m., so that's about 40 minutes into their evacuation, Michael and the rest of his coworkers reached floor 40, and this was the first time they saw firefighters, New York firefighters, running up the stairs to go fight this fire. And so naturally, Michael and the others asked the firemen if they knew what had caused this fire, what was going on, but the firefighters just said, look, we don't know exactly what caused this, but go down, it's safe down there. Michael would remember about seeing these firefighters that they all had a similar look on their face. They had this kind of stoic, just kind of neutral look on their face, very calm, very mission-oriented as they charged up the stairs in all this heavy gear. But years later, as Michael reflected on that situation, he thinks about their faces, and now he believes the look they had on their face was actually fear. And unfortunately, most of the firefighters that ran past Michael and the others and went up to fight that fire in the North Tower, they would all perish. A few minutes later, Michael and the others made it down to floor 30, and right around the time they got there, they heard people behind them, above them from higher floors, yelling for people to get out of the way. And so Michael turned around and looked up, and he saw there were some people carrying other people down the stairs, and they were trying to clear a path to get these injured people down. And so Michael, like everybody else, kind of sucked up against the side of the wall to let these people pass. And when they did, he saw there were 2 injured people. There was one guy who his whole shirt had been burned off of his back, exposing his bare back, and he had burns on the top of his shoulder. And then the other injured person was this woman with severe burns on her face. After they passed, Michael and the people around him kind of got back in line and just kept moving down the stairs, but now they were on edge. Everyone was kind of thinking to themselves, How bad is this fire? Who else got hurt? What actually happened up there? A few minutes later, Michael and his coworkers got down to floor 20, and that's when they saw there was this firefighter yelling to everyone, asking, hey, does anybody know CPR? I need volunteers who know CPR. And so Michael, he had been trained in CPR 10 years earlier in college, and while he hadn't done it in a while, he felt confident that push came to shove, he could do it. And so he and another guy that was near him volunteered to be these CPR guys. And so they went over to this firefighter who explained to them, stay right here and be ready to do CPR on anyone that is brought down to you. And if anybody else needs help, I need you to try to help them too. So just basically be here as a resource. And so Michael and the other volunteers say, no problem. And they stay right there. And the firefighter grabs all of his heavy equipment and he charges up the stairs. Over the next 10 minutes, Michael and this other guy did not need to perform CPR. However, they did assist one very heavy man that was having a very hard time breathing. They helped walk him down all the way to the bottom. And then Michael and the other volunteer, they turned around and ran back up to the 20th floor. And as they're running up, they're asking everyone around them, hey, do you need help? Do you need help? But nobody needed any help. And so when they got back up to the 20th floor, they were there for a couple more minutes. And then by about 9:50 a.m., there were no more people coming down the stairs. It was just Michael and this other volunteer. And so that's when they decided that it's time to go. And so they bounded down the stairs and they got all the way to the ground floor at about 9:55 a.m. And Michael, he opened the door that led out to the ground floor, which was the plaza level. And what he saw was the worst thing he had ever seen in his life. The people that were located in the north and south tower above the impact sites would have eventually realized they did not have an escape route. Stairwells were blocked, the elevators didn't work, and so naturally the only way to go was up. And so I'm sure initially there was some speculation amongst these people that a helicopter could come up and get them, or some other way they were going to be rescued. We just need to get higher and higher and higher. But eventually they got to the roof and they got to the upper levels and there was no rescue. And the fire that was raging below them from the jet fuel, it was growing and creeping higher and higher, and all this black smoke was leaking into the vents of these upper floors. And so the heat and the smoke and the flames, it was driving these people to the absolute top of this building. And eventually these people who were trapped, they would have realized there isn't a rescue that's going to get us in time. We're doomed. And so these poor people in their final moments, they picked up their phones and they called their loved ones one more time. And so there are all these totally heartbreaking messages of these trapped people calling their family to say how much they love them and how much they're going to miss them. And there are an equal number of messages of these people calling their family to say how scared they are, that they're not ready to die. Eventually, the fire, the heat, the smoke would become so intense that these trapped people would actually go outside the building and would hang on to the windows, dangling hundreds and hundreds of feet off the ground because there was nowhere else to go. And then eventually, when all hope was lost, these mothers and fathers, these wives, these husbands, these sisters, these brothers, these daughters, these sons, these friends, they began jumping off of the tower to their death. Almost all of them jumped alone, but at least one eyewitness saw a couple holding hands. One woman who was falling, in a final act of modesty, held her skirt down. Other people tried to make parachutes out of tablecloths and curtains, but as soon as they jumped, these things were ripped from their hands. The fall from the upper floors of both towers took about 10 seconds, and when their bodies hit the ground, they weren't just broken, they were obliterated. And so Michael, when he opens this door, he steps out into this lobby that's at the plaza level, and he turns and he looks at this huge set of windows that look out into this 200-foot-long stretch of open pavement that separates the north tower that he is in with the south tower. And scattered all across this stretch of pavement are about 50 different bodies. The majority of these people had jumped. The rest were either people that had fallen out of the tower from the impact of the plane, or they were passengers on board one of the two planes that actually hit the towers. Michael had no way of processing what he was looking at, because as far as he understood, there was just this fire at the top of the tower he was in. How could all these people be out here? What happened to them? And so as he's scanning the absolute horrors outside, he also sees there is blood all over the windows. And that was from the people that had fallen close to the building. And so as he's seeing all this blood and this carnage, he just puts his hand up over his eyes. Like he doesn't want to look at what's going on outside. He just can't possibly process it. And so instead, he and this other guy, they say, okay, let's not go outside, because if we go outside, something could land on us, a person could land on us. We don't know what's going on out there. Let's go down one more level, because there was another set of stairs right ahead of them in the lobby that went down to the shopping mall, and this shopping mall extended outside away from the tower, and there was street access, maybe a half a block away. And so Michael and this other guy he was with, they run over to the stairs, they go down into the shopping mall, and down there it's dark and the sprinklers are going off, and they just start running through this mall trying to get to these stairs that'll bring them back up to the street level. And as they're going, they run into another group of people that are doing the same thing. And one of the people that was with this group was the same woman who had been trapped up in the bathroom on Michael's floor. And so Michael put his arm around her and was just kind of being comforting, and they start walking together. And Michael realized she was very shaken up by the bodies she had seen outside. And even though Michael was very shaken up by it too, he comforted her and said, we got to keep going. We got to keep going. And so the two of them just kept on going until they see up ahead, there's an emergency worker with a glow stick kind of waving people to go towards the stairs, get up onto the street, get out of here, evacuate as quickly as possible. And so Michael and this woman, they run right past the emergency worker. They're not even asking any questions at this point. They just want to get away from whatever it is that's going on. And so they get to the base of the stairs when Michael hears this really loud cracking sound coming from somewhere outside. And so Michael and this woman, they run up the stairs, they get out to the street, and outside it's totally chaos. There's people running around everywhere. There are papers all over the ground and other office furnishings. There are things on fire, and Michael just instinctively looks to his right. He looks down the road because that's generally where he thought he heard that really loud cracking sound coming from. And so he found himself looking at the Millennium Hotel, which is this beautiful hotel on the other side of the road from where he was standing a little ways down to the right. And the windows of the front of the Millennium Hotel are like mirrors. They're very reflective. And he found himself just looking at the reflection on the Millennium Hotel, and he noticed it was reflecting the South Tower. And the South Tower was basically across the street from the Millennium Hotel, basically a half block to the right of where Michael and this woman were. And as he's staring at this reflection of the South Tower, he suddenly realizes what that loud cracking sound was. It was the sound of the South Tower, which was still full of hundreds and hundreds of people collapsing. And so Michael is watching this South Tower collapse through this reflection on the front of the Millennium Hotel. He snaps out of it and turns, and he and the woman just run back down into the mall as fast as they can. They can hear this unbelievably loud sound of thousands and thousands of tons of just metal crashing down almost directly on top of them. And Michael makes it to the bottom of the stairs in the mall and just leaps onto his stomach and covers his head. And he's yelling his wife and his son's name because that's all he can think about. And then suddenly everything goes black. And at the same time, suddenly his mouth, his ears, his nose, everything is just packed with what felt like sand, when in reality it was this white dust that was made from the collapse of the South Tower. And it was made up of pulverized concrete and asbestos and other very toxic chemicals. So as all these building materials are falling down into the mall, also there was this rush of this white dust. And so Michael is just laying there, he can barely breathe, and he's hearing all these big pieces of metal come smashing down all around him, and he's getting ready mentally to just die at any moment. But after a few agonizing seconds, the sounds of the falling materials from the South Tower began to cease after the collapse was basically done, and suddenly Michael began to hear the sound of other people crying and moaning. And so Michael suddenly was acutely aware that he had survived the collapse of the South Tower, but now was almost certainly going to die a slow and horrible death trapped underneath all of this debris. And so in total darkness, Michael just began trying to pull his arms and legs out from whatever it was that was on top of him. And amazingly, he got all of his limbs out. And right away, he began trying to pull this soot and this dust out of his nose and his mouth and his ears. And as soon as his mouth was clear, he began vomiting, and then he was trying to catch his breath. But every breath he took in, there was all this smoke in the air, so it was very hard to breathe. And so Michael managed to rip off his shirt, which was already soaked from the sprinklers when they first came in, and he wrapped it around his head so it was a little bit easier to breathe. And so breathing through his shirt, Michael finally composes himself. And then Michael, he's thinking to himself, I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now, but I know I need to move. And so he just started crawling. He has no idea where he's going. It is truly pitch black. But but he's just kind of low crawling up and down and over things. He doesn't know where he's going. And then there's this miracle. He sees a little ways away from him, a light comes on. He didn't know what this light was, but he's in survival mode. And at this point, light represents hope. And so he just started crawling towards this light, and he managed to go up and over all this debris. And finally, he gets to this clearing where this light is. And it turns out the light was a flashlight held by a fireman who had also survived the collapse of the South Tower. And so Michael crawls over right near this guy and realizes he can stand up. There's enough clearance. He stands up and he looks at this fireman who's this big guy with a mustache. And Michael says to him, "What are we going to do now?" And so this fireman apparently was remarkably composed, and he doesn't really say much to Michael. Instead, he just pulls his axe off his shoulder and kind of gestures for Michael to follow him. And so Michael naturally follows this fireman, and so he leads them over to this wall, and the fireman reaches out and he rubs the wall with his glove, and he rubs away a lot of soot and dirt to reveal a glass window. And so he tells Michael to stand back, and the fireman winds up and he smashes this window. And on the other side of this window is this Borders bookstore. And in the middle of this Borders bookstore is a staircase that goes up to the main floor and out onto the street. And so Michael thanked this fireman and then climbed through this opening into this bookstore. And as he was climbing through, he looked back towards the rubble and he saw there were lots of other people that were crawling out of the rubble and were getting in line to also climb into the bookstore. And so Michael, once he was through, he waited for a few people, and then they together ran to the staircase. They went up to the first floor and they went out to the street. And when they got out there, it was like the apocalypse. There was that white dust over everything, over people, cars, buildings, everything. They could barely see in front of them. And so Michael just reflexively began running away from the towers. And as he's running, he sees there's this woman just standing in the road and she's weeping. And Michael goes up to her and he says, "Are you okay? Can I help you?" And she is totally non-responsive. And so eventually Michael just leaves her and keeps on running. And after a couple of seconds, he sees there's this overturned food cart on the side of the road. So there's no one nearby. He runs over, he gets 2 iced teas out of the cooler. He opens one and pours it over his face to kind of clear his face off. And then he pours some into his mouth to wash his mouth out. And then he just keeps on running. And again, everything around him is just covered in this dust. And so as he's running, he eventually sees there's this cameraman that's got his camera trained in the direction of the towers. But the cameraman is not using his camera. Instead, he's hunched over his camera and he's just weeping, like he can't even report the news. And so Michael just kept on running and running. And at some point, he heard another very loud cracking sound behind him. But he didn't even turn around. He just kept on running. And it would turn out it was the sound of his tower, the North Tower, collapsing as well. And just like the South Tower, there were hundreds of people inside it when it fell. And so Michael would eventually just continue running until he reached New York University, NYU. That was where his brother was working, and he hoped he would be there so he could tell him that he survived, that he was okay. But when he got to NYU, his brother wasn't there. However, there were staff people there that saw how horrible Michael looked. He was covered head to toe in the dust. He looked crazed. He had blood all over him. And so they took him in, they cleaned him up, and they gave him a phone. And he was able to get in touch with his wife, and he told her that he was okay. And his wife and his entire family, they were convinced he was dead. They had been watching on TV. They had seen the tower collapse. They knew he was up on the 81st floor. And so they really believed he was dead. But unbelievably, he survived. Michael would ultimately make a full physical recovery, although he would have to have several surgeries to remove the 147 pieces of fiberglass that had embedded in his eyes. Because when the tower collapsed and all that dust and soot got pushed into his mouth and his ears and his nose and his eyes, there were little pieces of fiberglass that basically turned into splinters on his eyes. Like most other 9/11 survivors, Michael thinks to himself, why me? Why did I survive when so many other people didn't? But Michael tries not to dwell on that. Instead, he focuses on trying to honor the memories of the people they lost, and he focuses on trying to be the best father to his sons he can possibly be.
Morning stretches through the treetops, painting gold along the breeze. I can hear the quiet footsteps of a message meant for me. Feather light, the echo lingers, calling softly through the air. Like a whisper from the heavens, only dreamers learn to bear. Every moment feels anew, the sky is breaking.
So that's going to do it, guys. Before you leave, please go into the description and check out the links to the charities I provided. These are extremely highly rated charities that are still providing support to 9/11 victims, their families, and first responders. The ripple effects of this attack are still felt today by lots of people. And so these charities I've identified are a way to support people that really need it. And so I have already donated to all of the charities listed. So I'm telling you, these are incredible organizations.